On October 16, 1989, 36-year-old jeweler Richard Haywood was shot multiple times at close range inside the flat above his Southampton shop. For decades, nobody was charged. Then, in July 2026, police made an arrest. But the arrest did not close the case. Detectives continued appealing for information, continued searching for answers, and continued trying to identify the person behind an anonymous message received more than 20 years earlier. Tonight, we examine the forgotten tip, the accomplice police believe may have existed, and why investigators are still asking one person to finally break the silence. Richard Haywood was known to most people as Ricky. He operated Ambiance Jewellers on Shirley Road in Southampton. Below was the business where customers visited him. Above was the flat where he lived. It was the center of his working life and his private life, all contained within the same building. But on Monday, October 16, 1989, that building became the scene of a murder that would remain unresolved for almost 37 years. Ricky was inside the flat when he was shot numerous times at close range. Police have not publicly released every detail about what happened during those final moments. They have confirmed that the shooting happened inside his home above the jewelry shop and that the person responsible was close enough to fire repeatedly at him. This was not a death discovered in an isolated field or on an empty country road. It happened above a business on Shirley Road. People knew Ricky worked there. People knew where he lived. Customers had traveled from different parts of the country to visit his shop. Somebody knew enough about Ricky, his movements, or the building to reach him inside his own home. Then that person left. The immediate investigation became lengthy and complex. Officers collected evidence. They examined the scene. They took statements and began trying to reconstruct Ricky's final hours. They spoke to people connected to his business, his personal life, and the area surrounding the shop. They searched for anyone who could explain why Ricky had been targeted and who could have been responsible. But despite the scale of the investigation, no one was charged with his murder. The days following Ricky's death became weeks. The weeks became months. The months became years. For investigators, the case remained a collection of evidence, statements, names, and unanswered questions. For Ricky's family, it was something much more painful. It was the knowledge that somebody had taken his life and continued living without being held responsible. Ricky's mother waited for an answer. She wanted to know who had killed her son and why it had happened. But that answer never came during her lifetime. According to a statement released through the police, Ricky's mother never found peace after his murder. The pain slowly consumed her. She died without learning who had killed him. Ricky's sister was left carrying two forms of grief. She had lost her brother to violence. She had also witnessed what the unresolved murder did to their mother. Every year that passed without an answer added another year to the family's suffering. There was no conviction. There was no courtroom explanation. There was no moment when the evidence was presented publicly and the family was finally told exactly what had happened. Instead, there was silence. And somewhere inside that silence, police believed there were people who knew more than they had revealed. All murder investigations do not simply disappear. Evidence can be preserved. Statements can be reviewed. Names can be examined again. People who refuse to speak when the crime was recent can change their minds. Friendships can end. Relationships can collapse. Fear can weaken. A person who once felt loyalty towards someone involved can eventually decide that protecting them is no longer worth the cost. But for investigators to make progress, something usually has to change. New information must arrive. Old evidence must reveal something that could not be detected before. or a detail that once appeared insignificant must become important when placed beside another piece of information. In Ricky's case, one potentially important fragment arrived in 2004. That year, an unknown person contacted Crimestoppers. The information was provided anonymously. Police have not publicly revealed the exact words used in the message. They have not said whether it contained a name or location, a conversation, or a description of something that happened around the time of Ricky's murder. The identity of the person who provided it was not recorded. That was the purpose of contacting Crimestoppers. The person could share information without revealing who they were, but anonymity also created a problem for investigators. They could not return to that person and ask what the message meant. They could not ask how the person had learned the information. They could not determine whether the knowledge came from something they had witnessed, something they had overheard, or something another person had confessed. They could not ask whether the sender had more information that had never been disclosed. According to the senior officer leading the renewed investigation, the message was originally treated as one fragment. On its own, it did not add much to the case. It could not be properly connected to enough surrounding evidence to show investigators exactly what it meant. And so the anonymous message remained within the enormous collection of material connected to Ricky's murder. It stayed there as the years continued to pass. The sender may have believed the information had been investigated and dismissed. The sender may have assumed that it was not important. The sender may have expected the police to understand its meaning immediately. Or the sender may have known that one day, when combined with another piece of evidence, the message would make sense. Police have not revealed which of those possibilities is correct. What they have revealed is that the information later became more important. In October 2024, Hampshire and Isle of Wight Constabulary announced that detectives had reopened the investigation. The renewed inquiry was known as Operation Tango. A major crime team began reviewing the case again. By then, 35 years had passed since Ricky's death. Investigative techniques had developed. Forensic science had advanced. Evidence collected in 1989 could now be examined using methods that had not been available to the original investigators. A trace that could not be properly analyzed decades earlier could contain new information. An item previously considered exhausted could be examined again. But modern science alone could not solve every part of the case. Detectives also needed to understand the people surrounding Ricky and the information collected during the original investigation. That required returning to the paperwork. Thousands of reports and statements had accumulated around the case. Each record represented a person, a conversation, an observation, or a decision made during the investigation. The renewed team began going through that material. They were not simply reading the story of what had happened. They were searching for what may have been missed. They were looking for contradictions. They were comparing old accounts. They were asking whether one name appeared in several different places. They were examining whether evidence that seemed unrelated in 1989 could now be connected to information received later. And they were considering whether people who had spoken to police decades earlier should be questioned again. The public appeal generated a strong response. Within the first months, detectives had spoken to dozens of people who could potentially assist the investigation. By October 2025, police said they had re-examined thousands of reports and statements. They had also identified more than 200 people to revisit. Some had been questioned during the original investigation. Others were new to the inquiry. That distinction matters. It means the renewed investigation was not limited to repeating what detectives had done in 1989. New people had entered the picture. New lines of inquiry had developed. And information that once appeared disconnected was beginning to form a clearer pattern. Among the old material examined again was the anonymous information from 2004. This time, investigators were no longer looking at the message by itself. They could compare it with the new information gathered after the case was reopened. And according to police, those separate pieces were beginning to build a clearer picture. That statement created one of the most important questions in the entire investigation. What did the anonymous person know? Police have not disclosed the contents of the message. They have not confirmed whether it identified someone involved. They have not said whether it explained why Ricky was killed. They have not revealed whether it described something that happened before the shooting or something that happened afterwards. They have only said that the message now has greater meaning when considered alongside newer information. Detectives publicly asked the sender to contact them again. More than 20 years after that person first reached out, police were trying to reopen the conversation. The sender did not need to reveal their identity. They could still contact Crimestoppers anonymously. But investigators needed an opportunity to understand the information more clearly. Perhaps one additional detail could explain the original message. Perhaps the sender had learned something else during the years that followed. Perhaps the sender did not realize that the investigation had been reopened. Or perhaps the sender was still afraid. Whatever the reason for the continued silence, police made it clear that the information had not been forgotten. It had become part of the renewed attempt to solve the murder. The appeal also revealed another major development. Police said they believed Ricky's killer had at least one accomplice. That does not establish who the accomplice was. It does not explain what role the person allegedly played. Police have not said whether the possible accomplice entered the flat. They have not said whether the person helped before the shooting, during it, or afterwards. They have not publicly described how they reached that conclusion. But the statement changes the shape of the case. It suggests that police do not believe the murder was known only to one isolated individual. At least one other person may have helped, participated, or possessed direct knowledge of what happened. That creates another possible path toward the truth. When two or more people share knowledge of a serious crime, the secret becomes harder to control. One person may remain loyal while another becomes frightened. One may trust the other while the other begins speaking. One may believe that nobody will ever come forward. But nearly 37 years is a long time for relationships to remain unchanged. People move. They form new families. They lose contact. They become older. Their priorities change. The reason they remained silent in 1989 may no longer exist. Police repeatedly appealed to those people to think about Ricky's family. They asked anyone with information to come forward directly, anonymously, or to another person. They said that doing nothing was no longer an acceptable choice. The message was aimed at more than the person who fired the weapon. It was aimed at the possible accomplice. It was aimed at anyone who had heard something. It was aimed at anyone who had protected somebody involved. And it was aimed at the anonymous person who had already tried to share part of the truth in 2004. Then, on Tuesday, July 14, 2026, the investigation reached its most significant publicly announced development in years. Detectives arrested a 55-year-old man from Southampton on suspicion of murder. The arrest came almost 37 years after Ricky was killed. For a family that had spent decades waiting, it represented movement. For investigators, it created an opportunity to question someone under suspicion and examine the available evidence in relation to that individual. But an arrest is not a criminal charge. It is not a finding of guilt. And it does not mean the case has been solved. The man was questioned and later released on police bail until October 6. He has not been charged. police have not publicly identified him. He must be presumed innocent unless guilt is established through the legal process. That distinction is essential. The arrested man should not be described as Ricky's killer. He was arrested on suspicion of murder and subsequently released on police bail while the investigation continued. Police have not revealed what led them to make the arrest. They have not said whether it resulted from forensic examination, a new witness account, a review of historical documents, or several developments working together. They have also not publicly confirmed that the anonymous message from 2004 directly caused the arrest. The message was clearly important enough for investigators to issue a public appeal. But connecting it directly to the arrest without confirmation would go beyond the established facts. What police have confirmed is a sequence of major developments. The investigation was reopened. The surviving evidence was reviewed. Advances in forensic science created new opportunities. Thousands of reports and statements were examined again. More than 200 people were identified to be revisited. Fresh lines of inquiry were developed. The anonymous information from 2004 became more meaningful when compared with newer information. Police stated that they believed the killer had at least one accomplice. And then, in July 2026, a man was arrested on suspicion of murder. Even after that arrest, detectives continued appealing for assistance. That may be the most revealing part of the latest update. Police did not announce that the investigation was finished. They did not say they had obtained every answer they needed. They continued asking people to come forward. They said that even information appearing small or insignificant could be vital. That means there are still gaps. There are still questions that investigators want someone to answer. The person behind the anonymous message may still be one of those people. A possible accomplice may still hold another part of the story. Someone who knew Ricky may remember a conversation that did not appear important at the time. Someone may know who was interested in his movement. Someone may have noticed a change in another person's behavior after the murder. Someone may have heard words spoken privately that were never repeated to police. The investigators' appeal was not limited to Southampton. Police said people traveled from across the country to visit Ricky's shop. Some individuals who knew him later moved away from Hampshire. A witness or source of information could now be living anywhere. They could see the case mentioned and recognize details that others would overlook. They could remember the person they knew in 1989. They could understand why police believe an accomplice existed. And they could finally decide that the truth matters more than the promise of silence made decades ago. Crimestoppers is offering a reward of up to £20,000 for information provided exclusively and anonymously to the charity that leads to a conviction. The current reward deadline is August 14, 2026. Information given directly to police can still assist the investigation, but only information submitted exclusively through Crimestoppers can qualify for the reward. Anyone contacting the charity can remain anonymous. But this case is not truly about the reward. It is about the final piece of information. It is about one person deciding that 37 years of silence is enough. Ricky's mother died without knowing who had killed her son. His sister continued living with the pain of his murder and with the memory of what that unanswered loss did to their mother. For the family, time did not erase the crime. It only extended the period in which they were denied the truth. Police arrest has now brought Ricky's name back into public attention. But it has not delivered a charge. It has not produced a conviction. And it has not provided the family with a complete explanation of what happened inside the flat above Ambiance Jewellers on that October evening. Somewhere, there may be a person who remembers contacting Crimestoppers in 2004. That person may not understand how important their information has become. There may also be someone who knows the identity of the possible accomplice. There may be a witness who dismissed the memory because it appeared too small. And there may be someone who has carried direct knowledge of Ricky's murder for almost 37 years. The investigation is no longer gathering dust inside an archive. Detectives are actively reviewing evidence. They are following fresh lines of inquiry. They have made an arrest. And they are still asking the public for help. The person arrested remains uncharged and must be presumed innocent. The person who killed Ricky has not been convicted. The truth has not yet been established in court, but the silence surrounding this murder is no longer complete. One anonymous person spoke in 2004. Years later, their information began helping investigators see a clearer picture. The question now is whether that person will speak again, and whether somebody else, perhaps the person who has remained silent for the longest, will finally reveal what happened to Ricky Haywood.